All right, everyone, welcome to the Office of Career Development's Virtual Career Series. My name is Yalitza Negron Rivera. I'm the Director of Internships and Career Services for the college. Welcome to our session that's focused on resumes for public service careers. Today's session is going to give you a general overview of some key points on your documents that are really going to help you, especially speaking right now to the current times with so many folks still working remotely. A lot of recruiters are reviewing materials digitally, accepting them digitally. Quite a bit of you are also networking and sharing your materials with folks. It is going to be key to make sure that your document is reflective of what's trending, but also has some key elements to make sure that you represent yourself as the best qualified candidate for an interview and for a position. So I'm going to share my screen. You won't see anything just yet, but I'll get the presentation up and we will go from there. I do encourage folks that if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat box. I'm happy to answer them. Okay. All right, so now that we're jumping into the content, just a brief overview. Many of you have heard me share this before, but resumes are really an opportunity to share a quick summary and background of both your academic background and your professional background. Now, for folks who may be mid-career, you will eventually start to lessen more of the focus on your academic journey and perhaps complement more with an emphasis on your professional background and experiences. This is such a big advertisement tool, and no matter how much I share this with students, it's so important to understand that your document represents a marketing tool of yourself, because it's really helping an employer to understand the competencies that you've developed, the skills that you've demonstrated in your career, but most importantly, what is the value added that if they were to hire you, that you would be able to contribute. Now, some of that value may be transferable between one job to the other. It may not be the exact experience and skill, but it showcases your ability with training to succeed well in the position. So it is important to know that a lot of information gets shared with you on your resume, but it's only looked at for maybe about 10 seconds. So you really have to say a lot very quickly and in a succinct manner. And it's important to know also the distinguishment between this type of document, but also a CV. Now, I get questions on this often. I gave you some specifics here. And so for a resume or for a CV, resumes are probably the more standard document that our graduate students are going to use. Now, if you're a doctorate student or you're going to pursue doctoral study, a CV is a much more comprehensive, long version of a resume. It has much more of an emphasis on your academics, much more of an emphasis on your research positions or grants that you're interested in, okay? A lot more emphasis also on your education and your research potential. Not to say that students on a resume may not show their research potential or their skill set, but the intention is very different with a CV. CVs tend to be very long. In my career, my first director was also a faculty member, and he'd been doing this work for a very long time, and his CV was over 25 pages. Okay, for you, not that. For entry-level position and even for mid-career folks, 1 to 2 pages max, and especially if you're entry-level, 1 page is really the standard, but we'll get to that in a minute. So just keep in mind anything outside state government, local government, nonprofit, even private sector, consulting, we would be really looking at that field to have more of a standard resumes. Now, I'm only specific to a domestic resume. If we were looking at potentially careers in another country, perhaps they would be looking at a different format of a resume or emphasize information that we wouldn't find appropriate in the US. So I'm not going to go in that direction, but if you want to talk more about that, happy to connect offline. So some quick ways to check your resume, and if you're looking at your document, you can easily start to check these off and say, do I even have these? Okay, is my resume 1 page? If you've been in the field quite some time, perhaps 2 pages. If you're more than 2 pages, let's make sure we're chatting. Is the font you're using legible? Is it a type that avoids a lot of those serifs, meaning a lot of those kind of tail detailed ends at a font, right? That tend to be a little cutesy. You want to avoid a lot of that. That can tend to look very unprofessional. What about the size of the font? 10 to 12 tends to be pretty standard. As many of you can tell, I have glasses. 10 can be even pretty small, even with glasses, but it's still legible. Anything smaller than that makes it difficult to read. Traditionally, 11 to 12 is pretty good. You want to make sure to look at your margins. Are your margins half an inch all the way around, 1 inch all the way around? Anything less than half an inch makes it look way too spread out and makes the content look just too cluttered. So again, half an inch to 1 inch is pretty standard. Do you tend to use underlining, capital letters, bold, italics? What are you using to help to draw emphasis to certain elements of your resume, but at the same time to help make the reader easier to scan your document and get a quick sense of who you are? Okay, that's what's important here. And if you don't use it, that's something we will certainly work on, and you'll get to see in the examples here. You want to make sure that you are consistent in your layout and in your content formatting. Quite a bit of resumes that I've been reviewing for folks recently have had a lot of inconsistencies in formatting, whether it's small nuances in how they form their dates, excuse me, or how they are using their bold or italics. So you want to make sure that you are being consistent throughout. Are you using short phrases and sentences within your bullets? Now, let me phrase this to say, when I say short, I don't mean so brief and so general that it doesn't allow a hiring manager or recruiter to better understand the value, the accomplishment, and the skill set. But again, we cannot have paragraphs per bullet. 1 to 2 lines is max. Avoiding a template. So ask yourself, do I use a template for my resume? You will quickly know, because our office, when we're editing documents, will have a hard time doing track changes, or there'll be a lot of white space in your document, and you tend to find yourself almost pigeonholed in the sense of how you're articulating your experiences. Templates tend to also not allow you to really use the document and the breadth and the space of it to really capture your experience. And to be honest, if you think about it, if a lot of people are using the same template, it doesn't really show very much your experience or helps you to really stand out. So I do recommend doing the hard work, getting a Word document, and really spending the nitty-gritty time putting this information out there. Are you action-oriented, and are you emphasizing accomplishments? That really is a big next step in a lot of bullets for resumes, is not being accomplishment-driven enough. Quite a bit of people get into the habit on a resume to just tell a person what they are doing, what they've been responsible for, but they don't show how they've been able to demonstrate that skill or quantify it in some ways. So that's a different mindset in the sense of helping an employer to understand your value. Next, action verbs. That is a big area that I spend time reviewing on resumes. How are you helping to capture the appropriate action verbs that help an employer to understand what transferable skills you can bring from one experience to the next? What's important is you want to make sure at the same time you are watching your verb tenses. I recognize that sometimes folks don't spend time updating their resume when they finish a job. So sometimes the tenses might say present, but it clearly in their time frame shows that it's an old experience. That lack of attention to detail could be a red flag for an employer. So again, you want to make sure that you're spending time really looking at those. Again, I cannot emphasize enough the accomplishments, the achievements you've had, and any results. You never want to use language, which I'm kind of skipping a bit, but responsible for or duties included. Someone could be responsible for something and not be very good at it. And that's the best way I can describe it. It doesn't really showcase what you've been able to do with that responsibility. Sometimes it can be pretty easy when we're editing resumes to see that you actually used your position description to fill out the bullets. So be really mindful of that, and we can work through that individually. Of course, quantify whenever possible. Sometimes I have resumes that some people think I can't quantify anything. But what about that team of 4 that you worked in a project, or those 3 staff members that you supervised? You know, those smaller accomplishments still demonstrate management skills, still show your collaboration in action. So look at those unique ways where quantifying is reasonable. I've seen recently the use of some pronouns on resumes. Make sure to eliminate those. I, me, and we have no place on a document that is taboo language and really is looked at as careless on those documents. So if you tend to use those accidentally, no harm, no foul, just make sure to take them off, okay? Avoid too much white space. This is pretty easy, and I don't know if folks have a hard copy of their resume, but if you fold your resume in half and then fold that half into another half, so your document would basically be in 4/4, you are able to see if in fact a position, or excuse me, if in fact the document has too much white space in there. And if in fact you see a lot of white space, that tells you you have to be able to expand more on your document. So just a little bit of a hack there. If y'all want to hold on 1 second, I think I have one student who's waiting to be added. Okay, good. Jargon and language that's appropriate to your field. It is totally fine for you to use language that is appropriate, but be mindful, you don't want to toss around terms from your industry that you don't have a good grasp on. I find most students are actually pretty good at this, and alumni. So when you use the language appropriate to your field, make sure that you can speak to that if you were to be asked questions in an interview. And of course, proofread. I can't say that enough. You are spending quite a bit of time on a computer nowadays. I promise you, eye fatigue is setting in. So what you've seen your documents so many times, but then all of a sudden we see it and we may catch these little subtleties that can really help to strengthen your document. So make use of our career office for helping you to review your document, utilize your peers, utilize your faculty members. It's a great way to make sure your document is up to par. So I do want to take one quick segue before I go on to more detail about resume and just emphasize that there's going to be a training in October, I'm pretty sure, that we are going to, or probably late September, is going to focus on how to write a resume, but specifically a cover letter to speak to a job description. What we find sometimes where we see a lot of struggle with candidates is that they're not able to really break apart a job description and understand what are the key terms, the competencies, the exact information they should be pulling from in their resume and cover letter. And as a result, those documents tend to not look as tailored or as polished. Sometimes they can be a little too generic, to be honest. So job descriptions are such a great tool that you should be downloading and saving or copying and pasting those documents so that you can better adjust your document to speak to that specific employer. And I just put some key notes here. There's a whole training I'll be doing on this, but what I think is important is more on the next slide. Know your skill value and your skills. You really want to make sure that you're focusing on those transferable skills that are marketable skills. So think about examples such as public speaking, any experience you've had with data analysis, your research, your writing skills, right? And as you're trying to figure out bullets in your resume, these might be some good questions to help you elaborate. So if you're really struggling to be more specific and more tailored, questions like, what did I do in this role? How did I do it? What was the method that I used to accomplish this? Why did I even do it? What was the purpose or value that you brought into that experience or the problem that you were called to solve? And then what were the results, right? Those are really specific questions that can really help you to tailor your resume to an employer. And essentially is another strategy we will use to talk about cover letters, which will be a much more in-depth workshop style training that I'm really excited for because quite a bit of students have said they could use support on that. So additional best practices before we go into the anatomy of a resume. Simple little things that I think make a world of a difference. Make sure before you submit your resume, make sure to send it as a PDF. Sometimes I still get students who will submit a Word document to me when they're applying for something. Now it's different if I'm editing. I have to get access to the Word document. It makes my life easier. But a PDF when you're applying to an employer really keeps your formatting intact, doesn't allow things to shift if they're working off of a PC or a Mac. It just keeps everything organized. And for the most part, most computers don't have a challenge opening up PDFs. So it's kind of almost a no-brainer. You want to make sure that you label your resume appropriately. That may also seem pretty intuitive, but you'd be surprised. Some people just submit resume and title it resume. How are they supposed to know who that belongs to if they're filing it, right? Unless the person on the receiving end renames it. But do yourself a favor. Maybe use the suggested idea that's on your screen. You know, first name underscore last name underscore resume. Pretty simple. And if you have a common name, you might want to even use a middle initial, something that's going to allow folks to be able to better recognize you. Two major things you want to avoid on all resumes or delete right away, and that gives you a lot of space back. Don't include references on your resume. Those are put on a completely separate document. They don't belong part of a resume. And you do not want to include a professional career or summary or bio of yourself. A lot of employers tend to skip that section anyway and find it honestly a waste of space. That summary could be greatly used either in an elevator speech or could be maybe used in a LinkedIn profile. There's plenty of ways to use all that work, but just know that for a resume, no go. So let's go into the anatomy of a resume so that way we can continue building off of this. Okay. So the areas, I'm going to talk about all these, but I do want to note one quick thing. Anything that has the little asterisk next to it is optional. And I have to emphasize that because it does allow a little bit more individuality among resumes, but there's a double asterisk because I find that people commonly include objective statements and they use them incorrectly. So I want to make sure you know how to use those appropriately. So let's just jump right to the header. As you're looking at your document, really some key things you want to make sure that your name is visible, that your home address is accessible, and that one cell phone number, one email. That's all you need. You don't need multiples. It gets too confusing for a recruiter or hiring manager to know which one to contact. Okay. Now, what I do find is that you want to make sure that you're double checking your contact information because there have been times, and I use resumes to collect even phone numbers if I have to call a student for a meeting. And one time a student was like, oh my God, my cell phone number changed and I've been sending my resume and I didn't even bother looking there. Little subtlety, but you want to make sure that you're checking that. Also, for folks who have security clearances, you want to make sure that if this is applicable to your security clearance, stating that you have one should be put in your header so that the employer knows that right off the bat. That's important to indicate. Here are just some examples of headers. I've seen this trending. I will tell you why I have reservations with the second one, although I've seen it. For some folks, they've tried to justify to me, and I see this on blogs too, that they just don't feel comfortable having folks have access to their home address. But keep in mind that for working for a state agency, federal agency, they are going to need your address anyway. Any organization that needs it for a background check or security clearance is going to request that information, and it's easier for them to have it from the very beginning. So it's actually more strongly encouraged that you include it than not. But I have seen these two formats. I do think it could work, but don't be surprised if an employer comes back to you requesting the full street address. Okay. Objective statement. I had spoken to you about this a second ago. Let's go all the way down to that bullet where it says only. Only used for when you attend a career fair, whether it's virtually or in person, or if you're going to be featured in the resume book. Now, I believe I might have some undergrads on the call. You may not know what that is. Simply, the resume book is a digital publication that our office puts together. We have one dedicated to our graduate students and recent alumni. We are in the process of designing our own book for undergraduates, so that's more to come. And we publish it. The grads get published 3 times a year. The undergrads, we're actually going to start publishing once a year, see how it goes, and then go from there, okay? But keep in mind, objective statement. So back to that point. You only want to include the statement of those 2 times. When you apply to a full-time job, it is assumed that that's the type of position you are looking for. So therefore, you're basically stating the obvious. That's why it's not a good point to have that in there, okay? There's 2 examples that you could probably use, either A or B, that will allow you to frame an objective statement. They're very clear and to the point. To obtain an internship to gain experience in public administration, or to obtain an internship related to public affairs, utilizing demonstrated communication and leadership skills. Either one of those is appropriate to have. I tend to be a little bit better as a recruiter myself. I would say, wow, this person has these 2 skills. This is what I'm looking for. I would love to put them in this pile for consideration. but I do understand that everyone's in a different journey. So perhaps the first one might speak to it. But again, you want to be very clear and concise there. Okay, and I believe we might have had some questions in the chat. So I'm gonna just take a quick look into it. Is it acceptable to state at the end references available upon request? Actually, no, because that's actually a given. So if you're going to submit, putting that little line at the end of a resume, it's basically saying, I will submit this if requested, but most people would never say no. Does that make sense? It sounds kind of silly to say it, but it's true. If someone's asking for your references, you made it. You're making it to the end, so you want to make sure that you provide it, okay? One person wrote, security clearance received for 2020 census. Is that what you mean by security clearance in my header? Yes, if you, security clearance is really, is a special type of check. So there's background checks and then there's security clearance, and I can talk to you and more about this separately. But if you have a standing security clearance that you've gone through, that would be something that we would state there, because you have access to private information that wouldn't be previewed, right? So I can talk to you more, but that's what we would be looking for up there. These are great questions. Okay, so going on to the next one, education. So I tried to list as many degrees as I could possibly fit here. You may not be a student of Rockefeller, so I may have missed yours. So if I did, reach out or contact the Office of Career and Professional Development, or the person that's like me or Joan, who's our other staff member in the career office in your school, because they can tell you the exact degree. I find that folks tend to write these incorrectly often, especially if you're in a master of. I find a lot of people put master, comma, S or master in, and those are incorrect ways of writing out your degree. So what you see on the screen right now is the actual correct way to write out your degree. Now, just looking more specifically at this section, you're going to see that the highest degree was included first in the document, and then they added some additional information. The city and state of their institution, they added their degree, the expected time frame when they're completing their degree, the concentration within their degree, if you know it. Some of you might be very new to your graduate studies or to your undergraduate studies and have no clue yet, that's okay. GPA, as long as it's a 3.0 or higher, is fine. And some people have put some academic accolades on there too, totally fine. But it's important to see that this example is very consistent in bolding the names of the institution, italicizing the degree, and just being consistent in how they format it. That's what's really key here. I've heard from some students that because they started their graduate studies or their undergraduate degree, but they don't have it, they've chosen not to put it on your resume. Not good. You need to make sure that you out that you're currently in pursuit of a degree, because it'll make you qualified for available internships or potentially employment opportunities that are willing to take someone who may not have that degree completely done at the time. So if you started, name it, put it in there. Happy to make sure that we're looking at it, and please make sure you're writing our college's name correctly. That's a common mistake. We get a couple different versions of Rockefeller College, and there is a Rockefeller College in New York City, and we are two different institutions. So we just want to make sure that you have the right one. And by the way, our alumni look and screen by our school. So it's to your advantage to make sure that the name of our school is correct on your document. Honors, awards, and accomplishments. Now you saw on the last slide that honors was included in education, but there are some folks that do want to spend some time highlighting some unique accolades they've had, whether it's the dean's list they want to highlight a little more, maybe certain scholarships, maybe they got selected to be a graduation speaker, for example, that's on your screen. Some folks can do it. But I will find that folks who are engaged and do a lot or have gotten awarded a lot in their life tend to want to fill this section up a lot. Keep in mind the employer is scanning, so they're not going to have the time to go through all these nuances. So maybe pick 2 to 3 that you feel comfortable speaking about in an interview and leave it at that. That can be hard, and I know, but it's to your advantage. You really want to make sure that you're speaking to what's most relevant to you as a candidate. Coursework. Coursework is another section that's optional for folks. Coursework allows you to put just the title, the name of the course that you have already completed and that you've passed and done well. Sometimes students are like, hey, I didn't really do as great in this class. Should I include it? No, if you didn't master the content, you wouldn't want to mislead an employer that needs somebody who has that skill set. So you can list up to 4 to 8 classes total. Keep in mind there are some students who choose to highlight some of their core courses for their degrees. Not that that's a bad thing, but keep in mind everybody has to do those courses. So make sure to highlight some that are also going to allow you to be different, that may allow you to showcase a variety of skill set or lens or competencies you're developing. Okay, you never want to list, well, actually, let me put it this way. You don't need to list the faculty member's name. You don't need to list your grade in your class. It is all assumed that you've done very well in your coursework if in fact you've listed it here. Experiences. Now I get questions often with this. Experience is really a bundle and it can be its own various subgroups. So I'm going to give you some examples of different categories that you can name here. But really I'm talking about either your work, your internship, your volunteer, or your extracurricular experiences, okay? Now hold on one second, I did see a question. Can we list GPA if we haven't graduated yet? Yes, you can list your GPA, and if you already have one per semester, you are welcome to include that, and then certainly at the end of your program, you can do that too. Another question, is it customary to include state examination courses in a resume? Thanks. No, not common at all, especially because that tends to put you, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're put on an eligibility list. The only thing I would probably highlight wouldn't be on a resume, but if you took the Professional Careers Opportunity Exam or the PCO, which tends to yield quite a large eligibility list for hiring for traineeships and entry-level titles in New York State, you would name that potentially in a cover letter, especially if an employer is looking to hire off of that list, but I wouldn't put that on the resume, no. But great question. So back to experiences. Use bullet statements to describe your job responsibilities. Sometimes I see students put dashes or like very unique, intricate bullets. Keep it simple. You want to reflect your industry, okay? Action verbs we talked about enough. Verbs, we've talked about tenses, so I'm not going to harbor on that. Make sure not to use those taboo words that I mentioned. Responsible for, duties included, responsibilities included. Doesn't really say anything of your ability to do the job well. And if you're struggling to expand on your bullets, you may want to ask yourself these question words to help you. A lot of times when we're editing resumes in our office, we will ask you these and put a couple dots just to help prompt you a little more to think it through. Some other things to think about in experience. Optional names for this category. Sometimes students have to tell their career experience in a different way. So maybe you call your section professional work experience or relevant work experience because you're extracting out the jobs that best speak to that employer. And then any other jobs that are, wouldn't say as closely aligned with your industry, but perhaps you have transferable skills. Maybe you were working in a restaurant, maybe you're working in retail, maybe you were a caretaker of some kind. That would fit there because there is appropriate skills that may transfer to an employer, okay? If you, in this world of work, there's quite a bit of you who are working remotely, or perhaps you already were working remotely, but you're unsure where to name that, you can actually put in the place of city and state remote work in place of that, and that would suffice for that. When not to include on a resume, because this is a question I get about work experience, you want to avoid putting any positions that were way too short of a term. Less than a year, even less than a couple months, 6 months, can really raise some questions to an employer as to why the short brevity of a time with an employer. Jobs that are more than 10 years ago do not belong on a resume at all, but keep in mind on a CV, totally different story. But for a standard resume, no. And a company who had a concerning reputation. Now this is speaking a little bit more general, but there are times where folks have worked for employers, God forbid they ended up on the news, there's some major scandal or something that's happening that really causes alarm bells, could raise a red flag. Some folks may choose not to put that organization on their resume. And if so, if an employer were to ask you in an interview, you have to be prepared to say why did you choose not to include something. So it's something else that you want to consider, okay? I'm gonna get to questions in a couple seconds. I just wanna make sure that I'm answering a couple more things here, okay? And I'm happy to stay on past the time to answer questions if folks definitely need it. So feel free to keep popping them in the chat because I'm watching. So here's some examples of experience. Some of you may have already seen this. It's very clean and concise. Why I wanted to show this is because this shows progression from an internship to a full-time job in this employer at NYPIRG. So it gives you a sense of that. Sometimes I see students who get promoted essentially from an intern and hired on to full-time work. So this is a good way to explain it. But really keep in mind, very easy to read. The employer's name is pretty easy to find. They have the titles italicized consistently. The time ranges are not written by semester. I commonly see students who would probably say something like summer 2008 to fall 2011. In the employer recruiter world, they don't know what that means. Maybe of course, they probably went to college or had some higher level degree and may understand seasons, but they're not in our academia. They're not in our world. So you want to be very specific here, especially if you're going to write, and this is a whole nother training, a federal career resume. They ask for very specific dates, okay? And you can see the bullets aren't long, 1 to 2 lines per bullet, more than enough. I'm very cautious about giving students kind of a rule to say how many bullets per position. It's very subjective by candidate. Just know that 5 to 6 looks visually appealing. Beyond that, their document gets really long. So just be mindful of that. Projects. Projects is something that I don't see as often anymore on resumes, or it depends on a candidate, but I still keep it here because I want you to know that if there's a project in your academic study or in your, place of work that you think really demonstrates a skill set that the employer is looking for, you can name that and then give very clear and concise bullets that allow you to add some additional information about that experience. Again, I don't see this trending as much, but on occasion, I've seen a few resumes that have it, and that actually the project that they've done not only demonstrates a technical analytical skill, but at the same time it shows subject matter expertise because they really dove into a policy or some type of major issue. So that's why I would say it's still something that I don't want to completely remove, but good to know that you can do that. Going into the skills section. Some students choose to omit skills, but I'm really proud to say that a lot of you don't do this anymore. But when I started in my role here, quite a bit of folks chose to take it off. And we're like, no, employers are like, we need to know that, right? If you have no idea that someone knows how to use any of these computer skills, we can't assume that you actually know how to. So it's important to name it. Now in the skills section, specifically computer and language, some of you already know this. Some of you may not speak another language, so then just skip language, rename to computer. Yep, thank you, Sandon. Rename to computer skills, and just go from there. Totally fine to do that. But keep in mind, you want to be specific. You don't want to just name Microsoft Office Suite, because at that point, it's assumed you know how to use every aspect of the suite, which honestly, I find most folks actually don't. So it's good to know that as well, okay? So let me look at here. So more about skills, and this is speaking about what is trending right now. Social media mentions, I've seen a lot on resumes recently, and I just want to give you food for thought. If you're not going into a position in this field that utilizes social media in a way that you're using your degree for, I caution you a little bit because sometimes some employers may automatically see that kind of communications, public affairs, focus, and they may think that that's the kind of work that you're looking for. You may get canvassed for those. So if you find that that's not the type of positions you've used, or if you've only used social media for personal use, but not professional use, you shouldn't put that in your skills section, okay? Telework tools. A lot of us are working in a digital space right now, so it's important that you make sure that you can name Zoom, you can name WebEx, or Microsoft Office Teams. Quite a bit of employers use a variety of these, one of these. So if you have any experience even facilitating on these and really learning how to use this, it's to your advantage to name these, okay? Also, project management tools. Microsoft Office Teams tends to be a collaborative space for a lot of folks to work on. Basecamp is a tool that I'm familiar with from an old employer that I worked in and I loved. So I'm just naming that. I actually don't hear that as much in this field. But I would caution you to avoid putting in information such as soft skills like leadership or communication, or I'm trying to think of more general ones, public speaking. If you put those on there, the challenge with that is an employer won't know of a time that you demonstrated those. You could have plopped that on your resume just to say you've had it, and you may in fact have, but then in your experience, you never demonstrate it anywhere in your document. So basically it becomes a generalization or an assertion of your skill set. That's why you want to avoid those. So you really want to be specific to computer skills. For folks who've worked in our capital, the legislative retrieval system is something I commonly see. And also don't forget, you're going to learn Stata, another statistical tool. So you will also be able to add that at one point. Activities, and we're kind of winding up, so just letting you know that I'm happy to answer questions. Activities, quite a bit of you are engaged in some way, shape, or form, whether in your volunteer work or in your community of some kind. That is wonderful. A lot of employers look for that because that also makes you unique. But if in fact you're looking to include that, let's talk about it. Most common for this section, people will format it very similar to their work experience because they only highlight one or two. And I would caution that if your activities are one-offs, meaning once in a while I go to that soup kitchen, once in a while I go to read to kids in an after-school program, but you're really not invested in a way that shows that kind of leadership and management and collaboration, I would caution you on those one-time activities. And if you tend to do those and you're like, hey, well, how can I change that? You may want to approach the organizations you've been doing some on and off involvement and really consider asking if there's opportunities for you to be more involved. Okay. So make sure that if you do decide to include those, that you're spending time making sure that they're relevant to the employer you're applying for. So I gave you a lot to think about very quickly, and I promised 5:15, I said it, and I'm keeping to it. But here's some last minute things for you, and then I'm happy to answer questions. You want to make sure that you are making multiple copies of your resume that are tailored to different positions. My best advice is take the polished document that you are working with, whether with myself, with Joan, with whoever, even if you're not one of our Rockefeller College students, duplicate it and make it a longer version. Call it your master resume. This is where instead of maybe 3 to 4 bullets per experience, you're writing 10, 15, 20, it doesn't matter. It's for your eyes only. The reason being you never know when your resume is going to be asked for, and you want to make sure that you spend less time editing, because sometimes people will save over the original and then have to rethink, well, what did I actually do in that job that relates to this employer? You'll already have all of this information in one spot in a very long version of a resume, but then you can tailor it and cut it down and get it ready to send it on to a hiring manager. You always want to review and update it, especially after you finish an internship or experience. That's important for you to keep in mind. And of course, know that we're available to help you in reviewing those documents. So I'm getting to the very end of this, but I wanted to put our contact information up there as well. And I'm also going to quickly put into the chat, I think I have it available, is our, I'm going to see if copy and paste it. I have a quick evaluation form for folks to give us feedback on this session. Even though I'm not done, I'm going to answer some questions, but I did not want to forget that we collect that type of quick feedback from students. You guys really help drive our programming in the career office, so we do take your feedback seriously. So if you could take a few minutes to do that today or tomorrow when we follow up, that'd be great. So let me look back and see what questions folks had. Can we list, oh, I answered that one. Is it customary to include, okay, we answered that. Are there any exams similar to the PCO exam for federal positions? I would have to, Benjamin, I'd have to look into that a little bit more. Not that I'm aware of, to be honest with you. Not from that standpoint. I know New York State is very civil service test driven. Not that I'm aware about at the federal level. Let me look at what's the best place to fit in-house training? Oh, from OSHA. Actually, some folks may put those specific trainings either in their skills section and maybe say skills and additional trainings and put some of that additional information on there. Also, that makes me think of folks who are first responders who have CPR, maybe active shooter training, certifications, FEMA trainings. If you're in that realm too, I've seen those in there. But sometimes, depending on the type of positions you're looking for, we may elevate those a lot higher on a resume to make that employer see that much sooner rather than later. Anne asks, what if you have done a lot of contract work to gain experience? Assignments are about 3 months long. Contract work is not uncommon. Then we'd want to make sure that in your position, in your work experience, we're being very clear to the employer that you are in a contracted position. That way it doesn't raise questions to say, in fact, that you only were there for a short amount of time and were just moving from position to position without some commitment and long-term investment in time. That's fine. I'm glad you asked that question. That's a really good point. Can you list an internship if its duration was less than 1 year? Yes. Internships that are less than 1 year, which happens, some of them are by semester based or by season, fall, spring, summer. That's not uncommon. What I was referring to more or less in the presentation was about work experience that is much less, like if it was a full-time job but you were only there for 3 or 6 months, and then the next position you were about the same or a little under a year, and if that pattern continues, it does raise red flags for folks. Okay. All right, so I'm trying to see if there are any other questions. I'm going to stop my screen in 1 second. There's our contact information for folks. Please note that we have a physical location both on the downtown and the uptown campus, but we're currently remote for fall. So all of our appointments are either through phone or through a video conference like Zoom, and you're more than welcome to arrange appointments on Handshake. And we also each have virtual office hours for undergrads or grads. So if you have a question of when those hours are, please email rockefeller.careers. We're happy to help you.